To walk the road of peace, sometimes we need to be ready to climb the mountain of conflict.
Tommy said, Mr. President, you're wrong. Now, that takes a lot of guts.
I'm for peace and quiet, Mr. Lute. It's why I came to the UN. Quiet diplomacy.
Welcome to a special edition of A Foreign Affair, our monthly discussion about big shifts underway in international affairs. Next Wednesday, September the 1st, marks the 70th anniversary of the signing of the ANZUS Treaty. So this month, we've chosen to reflect on our alliance with the United States, its past, present and, of course, its future, which is being heavily discussed following the tragic course of events in Afghanistan in recent weeks. Joining me for this discussion are three esteemed guests: James Curran, Professor of Modern History at the University of Sydney, specialising in the history of Australian and American foreign relations; Susanna Patton's a Research Fellow in the Foreign Policy and Defence Program at the United States Studies Centre; and Paul Kelly is Editor-at-Large of The Australian, where he penned an important piece last weekend featuring the views of 4 former Prime Ministers on the developments in Kabul and the future of the US alliance. So welcome to you all.
Thanks, Geraldine.
Paul, could you take us back, please, to 1951, because history does matter here, and remind us how this treaty came about? It was something of a diplomatic coup for Percy Spender, the Foreign Minister.
That's right, Geraldine. I think the negotiation of the ANZUS Treaty was a triumph for Australia. It was very much the work of one man, Foreign Minister Sir Percy Spender. This was an Australian initiative. If it had been left to the United States, there would have been no ANZUS Treaty, no military alliance. And the fact that a country such as Australia was able at that time to negotiate a military alliance with the United States was a really significant diplomatic breakthrough. It represented a number of things. Australian diplomatic innovation. It symbolised us moving away from Britain. The logic of the treaty meant that at some stage or other we would fight a war without Britain, and we did that in Vietnam the next decade. The focus was on the Pacific. The message was that Australia's destiny lay in the region and in the Pacific. And of course it was a mutual treaty. Both sides were obliged to concern each other with the respective security situations of Australia and the United States. And finally, the treaty was a great opportunity. It wasn't just a document based on 11 articles. It was the opportunity for Australia in subsequent decades to build upon that, and that's exactly what happened.
Yes, and in fact a very interesting piece in today's Weekend Australian by Troy Bramston looking at Percy Spender's memoirs. Menzies wasn't initially, he didn't think we needed it. Churchill was quite upset about it. So this was Percy Spender's conviction that we couldn't rely on Europe again, and that we had to think to the future, and we simply couldn't be. We were in a way naked without it.
Well, that's exactly right. In fact, the mood of the Menzies cabinet on the eve of the 4 days of discussion in Canberra between John Foster Dulles and Percy Spender, the mood of the cabinet was pretty pessimistic about whether we could even get the treaty and whether we might have to rely instead on a presidential declaration. Menzies had previously described the idea of a treaty as a superstructure built on a foundation of jelly. So there was no doubt about his scepticism. After the negotiations were finished, Spender went to the lodge, and Menzies said to him, how did it go? Spender took the draft treaty out of his pocket, gave it to Menzies and said, read this. Menzies read it and said, well done, Percy. Come inside and have a brandy.
Well, even so, it's only about 800 words, isn't it? There's been quite a lot of controversy over how it can be interpreted.
there's always been a lot of controversy about the wording, and one of the ironies about this, of course, is after we got the treaty, Australian politicians and officials then started to worry, what does the treaty mean? If Australian troops are caught in a conflict with Indonesian troops in the region, will the United States support us or not? Now, eventually what happened was we came to understand that the words of the treaty, while significant, weren't all that important. What mattered was the partnership. And we turned ANZUS, along with the United States, into a political institution in its own right, based on military cooperation, interoperability, defence procurement over decades, intelligence sharing, political cooperation, AUSMIN, political dialogue, trade, a free trade agreement, people-to-people network. So essentially, we created a partnership on the treaty. Now, of course, it wasn't just because of the treaty. We had Australian-American ties developing anyway, but essentially, a political institution has been created on the foundations of this treaty.
Yeah, now, James Curran, you've made the argument that even though ANZUS was the central security arrangement, etc., that Paul's just described during the governments of Whitlam, Fraser, Hawke and Keating, in other words, bipartisan, they took a different approach to it than the one we've been adopting since the mid-1990s. So explain more, please.
Yeah, well, I think, Geraldine, that, with the virtual end of the Cold War in East Asia from the early 1970s, and I guess with some of the frustrations that Australian governments had felt at not being consulted on the end of the Vietnam War or cessation in bombing or the Nixon Doctrine or indeed the metamorphosis in American China policy, you had a Prime Minister, for example, like Whitlam, who came in and said, well, we need a less adulatory relationship. ANZUS is not the be-all and end-all of Australian foreign policy. Australia should have the capacity to work both within and sometimes without the alliance. And by and large, that was, I guess, the framework that was followed by the Fraser, Hawke and Keating governments. Those prime ministers and those administrations, I think, had as their fundamental watchword the need for Australia to comprehensively engage with Asia, with the countries and cultures of the region in a new way. Now, ANZUS and the alliance still remained the fundamental first principle of Australian foreign policy in that era, but none of those leaders did anything significant to inject the alliance with greater meaning. That's not to say they walked away from it. They didn't play it down. Certainly Bob Hawke was much more effusive, I guess, in his language on the alliance than Gough Whitlam. He was conscious of the problems that Whitlam had with Nixon. But I think it would be fair to say that they front-loaded Australian diplomacy with a regional vision at that time. Now, that included America, but it was more, I guess, that the sense of Australia connecting to this region in a different way, leaving behind white Australia, not having the alliance prism as the only prism through which they understood engagement in the region. I think that was the key kind of factor in that era.
And what impact did the September the 11th attacks have on the alliance, in your view? ANZUS has only been invoked once by John Howard after those attacks.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, geez, the bookend that you have now in recent weeks with the fall of Kabul, just on the cusp of the 70th anniversary of ANZUS, and John Howard being in Washington 20 years ago for the 50th anniversary and happening to be there by sheer coincidence at the time of the September 11 attacks. I mean, the crucial phrase to come out of that era, I think, is John Howard's expression at the time of the Iraq War, where he said the US alliance is going to get more, not less important as the years go by. And I think since that time, leaders on both sides of the major parties have by and large tightened the American embrace. I mean, Julia Gillard's decision to welcome US Marines on Australian soil is, I think, in many ways the kind of guarantee that Australian leaders have long wanted that they haven't been able to find in the language of the treaty itself, right? And you look at Scott Morrison toasting 100 more years of mateship. I mean, the embrace has become even tighter, I would argue, than it was in the Howard period. I'm not suggesting for a minute that the Prime Minister-President relationships are as close as they were between Howard and Bush, but there's no doubt that we are completely locked in to the American position, I think, on most of the big questions, certainly in this part of the world.
I want to go to what that does to our politics or the influence, but I want to bring in Susanna. Susanna, what would you say that the most significant shift in this alliance is the one we're currently witnessing, where the United States is surely turning its focus to its own region? I mean, that is the clear implication, isn't it? I suppose you can debate this from President Biden's behaviour, but how do you see it?
Well, that's certainly been the hope that Australia has had since the US first announced its pivot more than 10 years ago. But I think we're really yet to see that be reflected in US policy in concrete terms. And
you're talking about the pivot to Asia, but I'm saying they're pivoting domestically. They're pivoting there.
Pivoting.
Yes, isn't that what is the great challenge now for us?
The inward turn. Well, I mean, I think if we're talking about US foreign policy post the fall of Kabul, then, I'm not sure that really changes the calculus for Australia all that much. Because I think if we look at what President Biden said, he said the US would not maintain a military presence where it did not have a vital national interest at stake, and that it would have its own self-interest front and centre, and domestic political opinion would count. Now, those are uncomfortable truths for Australia to hear, but I don't think that they're anything new. And I think that if we look at the record of Australian policy over the last few years, we can already see that Australia has had the intention to become more self-reliant, to make more of a contribution within the alliance, because we recognise that the US will not be able to be everywhere all the time in the way that it could during that unipolar moment in the 1990s.
Yes, I mean, despite its signalling about this, what we've seen again this week as Vice President Kamala Harris, for instance, has been visiting Singapore and Vietnam, is quite challenging. You released a report yesterday suggesting that the Biden administration has not yet actually presented a serious Indo-Pacific policy.
I think that's right, and that's concerning for Australia, in my view, because although the US has made competition with China its central focus, it's really doing that at the global level and with a very long-term view in terms of a competition of systems. But what we see in the Indo-Pacific now is that the US really needs to act with a lot more urgency. And so we're seeing that on both the defence side and in terms of the economic piece, the lack of US economic engagement with the region, its withdrawal from the TPP. That sends a very powerful signal to regional countries that the US doesn't see its interests as being so important in our region. So that's quite concerning.
I'm just to let listeners know, for our August Foreign Affair, James Curran is my guest, Susanna Patton from the United States Studies Centre, and Paul Kelly, the Editor-at-Large of The Australian. OK, let's look at where all this takes us now. And I'd like to play you a very quite powerful summary by Hugh White, the analyst, from a webinar he conducted this week at the Australia-China Research Institute, 10 years after he made his claim that Australia really had to start facing up to much more of its own, standing on its own 2 feet. He made a range of claims with his big paper 10 years ago. Let's hear what he said.
To be honest, I don't see anyone in government, or for that matter in the opposition, who shows signs of really having committed to the challenge that we're facing, the kind of energy and imagination and courage, for that matter, that's going to be needed. That's why I think Australia is in grave danger of screwing up what is one of the most important national challenges we've ever faced. It sounds melodramatic, but it's the biggest shift in Australia's international setting since European settlement, and we're getting it wrong.
Now, Paul Kelly, I wonder what your reaction is to that. Are there game-changing events underway now, Kabul just being the peak of it, that does force us to reconsider what the alliance means?
Well, there certainly are game-changing events underway, Geraldine. I don't think Afghanistan as such is a game-changing event, but the behaviour of China and China's ambitions to dominate the region certainly are. I think some of Hugh's comments are somewhat melodramatic. It seems to me what we have to do at the moment is work on many fronts. The alliance is an asset for us. And what we've got to do is we've got to look at how we can work to renew, adapt and modify the alliance to the current challenges. Australia wants a United States which is committed to the region strategically, economically and in a trade sense. What we want to do is we want to integrate the alliance with our Asian engagement. That's particularly important. That's the policy of the government. That's the priority of the Prime Minister. Witness the Quad. Now, while the Quad is not a solution as such, it reflects a basic strategic approach by the government, which is very important. We're in a situation at the moment where China is trying to break Australia's will and intimidate Australia and force us into a whole range of strategic concessions. Now, in this situation, of course, what's required, I think, is a policy which works effectively in the region and with the United States. I think this is not the time at all for Australia to begin to distance itself from the United States. What we've got to do is we've got to influence America, and we've got to try and ensure that America doesn't head off in the wrong direction. And there are a number of contradictory wrong directions. We don't want the United States to engage in full containment of China. We don't want the United States to decouple from China in an economic or technological sense, and we don't want the United States to retreat from the region. Now, they're contradictory outcomes, but what we've got to try and do at this stage is influence America and integrate that alliance with America into our Asian engagement, which, after all, has been the traditional form of Australian strategic policy now for several decades.
One of the things he went on to say, Paul, Hugh White, in this very interesting webinar was that he just thinks there's a failure of imagination to think of our region dominated by without the primacy of a European, an Anglo-Saxon power. Do you think that's right?
Well, what I'd say about that is it's clearly the objective of the Australian government to try and ensure that China does not dominate the region, that the region does not succumb to a situation where it's dominated by China as the regional hegemon. Now, that might happen at the end of the day, but clearly that is not in Australia's interests. The view of the Australian public, the Liberal Party and the Labor Party is to try to ensure that that doesn't happen. And if it does happen, then that would significantly change the conditions of Australian sovereignty and agency. There's no question at all about that. So that's the objective. What we've got to try and do is put in place a form of effective strategy to ensure that that goal can be achieved. Maybe it can't be achieved, but I think Hugh White is wrong to begin the analysis by saying we have to accept Chinese primacy in this part of the world.
Well,
because
he said joint. He actually prefers a concert of powers rather than sort of a balance of power. Can I just bring James in there? What do you think about that?
Oh, look, I mean, the elephant in the room is surely the America that we're talking about right now, isn't it? I mean, with a riven America, with two successive presidents now making it clear that their priority is domestic renewal, with uncertainty over the attitude of future American leaders to this part of the world. I mean, I think this was part of the issue that Hugh was dealing with the other day, wasn't it? You know, who in Canberra has the capacity to make that imaginary leap to a world where American power and purpose is obsessed with its domestic problems? You know, I can probably, just getting back to the point about influencing the Americans in Asia, I can probably only think of two instances in the history of the alliance where one would be Vietnam. This is where the Australian government has actually had primary influence on the Americans. One would be Vietnam, but that was more from our national interest purposes to keep them maintain their presence in Southeast Asia. The second would be APEC. In the late 80s and early 90s with Keating and the APEC Leaders Summit. But I think we're dealing with a very different America now, and I think this is where the problem of imagination comes in. Now, only Tony Abbott recently has raised the topic, and he did so as opposition leader in 2014, where in Washington he said no one should want to find out what a shrunken America might mean. Now, he wasn't undertaking a reassessment. He was, like Julie Bishop and Malcolm Turnbull later, willing, almost pleading with the Americans to rediscover their global resolve. But I think both major parties have shown themselves utterly incapable of facing up to this question of a less committed America. You know, we've spent the best part, Australian political elites, of a decade in basic denial about the persistent racial, cultural and socio-economic currents in American politics that, short of war, will dominate any White House. So I think we've got a problem in the national strategic imagination. The addictive strategic drug of the alliance is so powerful that sometimes it has the capacity to detract from a more self-reliant Australian view of the region and the world.
I mean, Susannah, interesting. You also think we have yet to come to terms with the fact that the US isn't the unparalleled military and economic power it was during the Cold War.
Look, I think that Australia is coming to terms with that. But I think one of the points that I would make to what James has said is that now, as Paul indicated, our relationships with Asia and with the US are much more mutually reinforcing than they ever were. So I think what Australia needs to be doing is really increasing its engagement in Asia. We can present that to the United States as an alliance contribution because we have a shared interest in maintaining a favourable regional balance of power in Asia. And then through other forums like the Quad, like the Trilateral Security Dialogue, we're networking our relationships between the US and Asia in a way that we once didn't. So just one very brief example of that, when Australia's relationship with India improved significantly, that paved the way for the reinvigoration of the Quad, which then became a platform for the US to engage in the region. So it has a kind of virtuous cycle that I think wasn't there before. So that's quite positive for Australia.
Yes, look, I mean, it's pretty challenging to hear this from an Australian perspective. I mean, in your piece, Paul, you quoted, as I say, all the Prime Ministers, and Kevin Rudd was quite blunt, actually. We have to simultaneously plan for a robust regional and engaged America while simultaneously planning for the worst, an America that begins to retreat. That means a radical reappraisal of our national economic and strategic preparedness to manage our own core strategic interests. I mean, there would be an enormous amount extra money required, would it not, from within by the Australian taxpayer to fully even develop what Susannah's talking about. You know, I can see sort of funding for the ABC stripped bare while we pay money for extra missiles.
We might also talk about funds going into health and education. Look, you're completely right, Geraldine. I do think there's a recognition on both sides of Australian politics that we have to do more. We have to be more self-reliant. We have to be more self-reliant in terms of our own destiny and in terms of working with the Americans. And there's going to be a price to pay for that. And I think that the electorate is not sufficiently aware of that at the moment. In relation to Kevin Rudd's comments, I thought they were very good because they highlight the unpredictability of the situation with the United States. We want the United States committed to this region, but we recognise that the domestic tribulations in America might mean that America has changed fundamentally, as James has indicated, and that America is really on the pathway towards some form of retreat. Now, we'll have to see the way that plays out. But, I mean, essentially, the task of Australian diplomacy is to try and work with the United States as our major alliance partner and ensure that America doesn't make a fundamental mistake. And
they may not think it's a mistake.
Well, I just identified those sort of fundamental mistakes. One would be to engage in full containment of China. Another would be to retreat from the region. Now, I think actually America won't go in either of those two directions. Maybe it will muddle along on some form of middle course. But if it does that, then that creates a lot of opportunities for us in terms of working with the United States and trying to ensure that it remains committed to this part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, one of our listeners has come through, Susanna, and said there's been no mention of climate change at all in this discussion. And, of course, some people are speculating that maybe one of the possible outcomes of the great crisis that faces us is that this could provide some sort of cooperative engagement between the superpowers, the jostling for preeminence. Now, can you see that might be the case? And again, what role does it leave for someone like Australia?
Look, I think the trajectory in terms of how the US is going to approach its relationship with China is fairly clear, in the sense that they've said there will be elements of cooperation where it's in both countries' interests, but ultimately President Biden has said that this is about a competition to win the 21st century. And so I think the focus very much will be on doing what it needs to do to rebuild its domestic resilience, its domestic sources of strength. And that will very much be the focus.
And you are concerned, are you not, about, in fact, the big sort of rhetorical draw from America at the moment to the region, such as it is an emphasis on democracies together. You don't think this is the right way to go?
Look, I think it really reflects the focus of the US in its competition with China, which is very much focused at the global level. It's about working with European partners on global norms, and it doesn't really reflect the kind of urgency about the issues that concern Australia most, which is the sort of quite rapidly changing balance within East Asia. And so I think what our report sets out is the need for the US to focus more on responding directly to regional priorities as they stand at the moment, and perhaps avoiding the temptation which it always has, which is to view countries in East and Southeast Asia as really being subsidiary to its global policies.
I'm just going to sort of wind up. James Curran, Hugh White's claim that he couldn't see anybody either side of politics at the moment prepared to really discuss, to take further what we're discussing today. Why is that so, in your view? Why this has become such a red-hot discussion that if you falter, you're seen to be somehow putting Australia's securities at stake? We can't stay stuck like this, can we?
No, it's not healthy. I mean, I think you have a position at the moment where the Labor Party is still kind of scorched from the experience of Mark Latham in 2003-04, where he called for Australian troops to be brought home from Iraq, and he was depicted as being untrustworthy on managing the US alliance and faulty on national security. And that brought back a lot of painful memories for the Labor Party from the kind of rhetorical drubbing they copped during the Cold War on some of the same questions. You know, when they opposed the construction of the construction of American intelligence facilities, and when they opposed the commitment of troops to Vietnam. So, you know, to question the alliance is to question, you know, a kind of a cardinal faith. There should be a lot more robust debate around it, I think. And, you know, to be able to make the point that, you know, as I said before, greater self-reliance within and without the alliance is possible. Previous leaders have showed that it's possible. The alliance is able to endure a divergence of interests. In fact, the more senior American policy officials, I think, in moments of candour, will tell you that what they don't want is an obsequious lapdog of an ally, but they do want the kind of ally, which is, I think, Paul's point, that says to them, don't engage in the folly of these kinds of mistaken policies, such as thinking that you're up for a new, long, Cold War of containment against a rising China. So there, you know, if Australia's going to do more and be more influential, then that's the kind of tack it's got to take. That is, trying to help shape American policy in more fruitful and constructive directions. But I think there's got to be a change of tone and tenor here, that to have a robust debate about where this alliance is heading and peeling away the kind of misty-eyed sentimentality that just descends like a fog across strategic clarity, I think would be a useful first step. Mateship will get you so far. It has its purpose, but it's become a kind of a wistful reminiscence and a descent into nostalgia.
Final word to you, Paul Kelly.
Well, look, I think a lot of the renewal and reassessment is actually underway. And I think the evidence of this is fairly clear. Both Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison have managed the United States very effectively under Trump and so far under Biden. The differences between Australian and American policy under Trump were very, very significant. They were managed effectively. There's a recognition, I think, within the government and in the Labor Party that there will be diverging interests. I think there's also a recognition that the alliance needs to be adapted and modified to a new situation. Government is actually working on that. The Quad is a practical example of that. I think we need to be very careful about talk of imagination and reconceptualising things. What's required here are practical, down-to-earth proposals, practical, down-to-earth diplomacy and initiatives that change things on the ground. I think that's where government is, and I think actually we're making quite a lot of progress on that front.
All right. Well, look, thank you all very much indeed. A big topic and with lots to come. James Curran from the University of Sydney, Susanna Patton from the US Study Centre, and we'll put her latest report on our website, and Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large of The Australian, with a big piece again today. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thanks, Geraldine.
Thanks, Geraldine.
And I welcome your thoughts on this, and a lot of you are coming through. It's a hard discussion, isn't it? But someone's got to have it. And I hope that we've encouraged you to engage even more.